Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the lives of three early pioneers in the consciousness movement. Gerald Heard, the philosopher, Aldous Huxley, a great writer, and Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. My guest is Don Lattin. He is the author of many books, including Shopping for Faith, American Religion in the New Millennium, Jesus Freaks, a true story of murder and madness on the evangelical edge, Following Our Bliss, how the spiritual ideals of the Sixties shape our lives today, the Harvard Psychedelic Club, how Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Huston Smith, and Andrew Weil killed the Fifties and ushered in a new age for America, Changing Our Minds, Psychedelic Sacraments, and the New Psychotherapy. And the book we'll be focusing on today is called Distilled Spirits, Getting High, Then Sober, with a famous writer, a forgotten philosopher, and a hopeless drunk. Don lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Don. It's a pleasure to have you with me on New Thinking Aloud.
Great. It's great to be with you, Jeff.
You know, I know we have a number of things in common. We were both students at Berkeley in the 1970s and lived in the San Francisco Bay Area where you still live. I lived there for 30 years.
Yeah, no, I remember when you had that wonderful show on KPFA and other platforms, I think, later on. Yeah.
So we have shared a common experience of the 1960s, but I think what's really exciting about your book, Distilled Spirits, is you're looking at the predecessors, the antecedents to the whole consciousness psychedelic movement, and it's hard to think of a better figure to focus on than Aldous Huxley and his friends.
Yes. Well, it's funny you mentioned that because this book came about after I wrote a book about another group biography based on four guys in the 1960s who really helped define the 1960s. Or Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Huston Smith, and Andy Weil. And so I really liked that group biography form, so I wanted to take the story back to more of a foundational period for that and write about three characters from the 1950s, including Huxley. Yeah.
When I was a high school student in the 60s, Aldous Huxley's novel, Brave New World, was like the thing to read. And then he wrote an essay, Brave New World Revisited, in which he amplified on those ideas. But I'm guessing that today, a lot of our viewers may not realize what a key cultural figure Aldous Huxley was.
He was, and long before the 1950s or 60s even. I mean, he was really well known. He was probably one of the best known writers in the English language in the 1930s, which is when Brave New World came out, and into the 1940s, and even earlier. I mean, his early work is from the 1920s or beforehand. You know. His grandfather was Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a famous evolutionary thinker. They called him Darwin's bulldog for his defense of evolution. And you go back and look at the early stories written about Aldous Huxley, and they always mention he's the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley because no one ever heard of Aldous Huxley yet. But he was a towering figure, especially between the wars, between World War I, World War II, and then afterwards. Yeah.
I'm under the impression from your book that he came of age in the late 20s, early 30s, sort of the jazz age, and which was similar in some ways to the 1960s in terms of sexual mores, for example.
Yeah, the Roaring Twenties and all of that. Yeah, he was born in, I think it was, if I remember correctly, 1895. I think Queen Victoria was still on the throne. That's how far back he goes. So yeah, he was reacting like a lot of people in his generation, reacting to the sort of the Victorian era being in decline, and also after World War I, all the alienation that produced by World War I and kind of the hopelessness and so lost generation they called them, and they're looking for another way. And then of course the 20s were a very exuberant time in many ways in England and the States, at least a lot like the 1960s. Yeah, we seem to go in cycles, don't we?
So he's really, I think, the main character in the story, but Gerald Heard is also very important as a philosophical figure and an anthropologist and a public intellectual.
One reason I wrote the book was people have completely forgotten about Gerald Heard. Heard. People haven't heard of Gerald Heard. But he was also a very important figure between the wars. And what's interesting about Heard and Huxley is they became friends in the 1920s. And, Huxley was a real skeptic, maybe even a cynic, social satirist, had a real edge in his early writings, novels and essays. And it was Gerald Heard who kind of got him interested in spirituality and philosophy and religion, to the dismay of many Huxley fans, actually. So they were kind of co-mentors. They influenced each other in a lot of interesting ways, and they became friends. They met in the 1920s, and they both came to the U.S. together in 1937 on a speaking tour. Actually, it was a pacifism speaking tour. They were both involved with the pacifist movement in England, which was not always a popular thing to be as the war machine was revving up, in Europe in the late 1930s. But yeah, they came over together, and they didn't intend to stay. It was a lecture tour. They were already both, well known. And they wound up living the rest of their lives in the United States, mostly in Los Angeles area.
Huxley was married. They came on that trip with his first wife, Maria, and Gerald Heard was gay. He had a lover who joined him eventually in Los Angeles, but he came by himself with the Huxleys and their son.
Yeah. He was gay, and of course in the closet at the time. And, a lot of gay people see Heard. I mean, Heard's known for a lot of different reasons. I mean, gay people see him as one of the kind of early gay writers, even though he wasn't specifically writing about that, but he had a certain sensibility, I guess. And, he's also popular among science fiction fans because he wrote some science fiction. And he really got interested in the whole UFO thing and later in the 50s and psychic phenomenon. So Gerald Heard was a real polymath. He was all over the place, interested in all kinds of things, as was Huxley. Neither of them wanted to become like a specialist or be labeled or. There's a woman who wrote the real biography about Gerald Heard, and the title was Beyond the Pigeonholes, meaning you can't put him in one hole, right? He had a much broader interest.
I was actually first acquainted with Gerald Heard in 1975 when I attended a workshop with Jean Huston, who you cite in your book, who knew him. And she called the workshop Dramanon, which was based on the Dramanon is the maze in the cathedral at Chartres. And she based that on a Gerald Heard short story about entering into an altered state of consciousness while walking the maze.
Oh, interesting. Was that the labyrinth?
The labyrinth, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That whole movement became very popular. There's labyrinths everywhere these days.
and that goes back to Gerald Heard's story.
There you go. Another way that he was, I first heard of Gerald Heard, I think in the 80s, if I remember correctly. It was as Michael Murphy, who founded, along with Dick Price, Esalen Institute in the 1960s. And they got the idea for Esalen partly from Gerald Heard, who had a similar but different kind of a retreat center down in Southern California in the 1940s called Trabuco College. So that's when I first heard about Heard, and then his name kept popping up. Huston Smith, the scholar of world religions, who I profile. Who I knew Huston because I was a reporter in San Francisco covering religion for many years, and so I knew Huston. We both lived in Berkeley, and he would tell me about Gerald Heard and how influential Gerald Heard was in his life and how he met Huxley through Heard. So there was that. And then at some point along my own personal life journey, I got involved in 12-step movement, Alcoholics Anonymous, and Bill W., one of the co-founders of AA, turns out that he knew Gerald Heard. So that's one reason I've always been kind of interested. I didn't really know a lot about him, but his name kept popping up in all these different contexts. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Bill Wilson. He, as you point out, was a notorious drunk. I think that's the phrase you use in the subtitle of the book. But he managed to cure himself, at least partially.
He certainly cured himself of drinking. Yeah. No, he was a businessman, a Wall Street type in the 20s. During the Roaring 20s, the economic boom time of the 20s, and alcoholic, heavy drinker, and his life collapsed around that, as it often does for hardcore alcoholics during the Great Depression. And he had 4 stays at a kind of a high-end, they didn't call them rehab centers now, but it was a hospital that specialized in alcoholics, including a lot of businessmen, and they were mostly men, of course, then, who were affected by the Depression, and their drinking maybe have bottomed out around partly because of what was happening in the economy at the time. Anyway, Bill had 4 stays at this hospital. That shows how difficult a case he was. And during the last stay in the early 30s, he had what you could really call kind of a spiritual awakening, kind of a revelation after hitting bottom. And it was this vision that inspired him, as the story goes, to start Alcoholics Anonymous from the depths of his despair there. And he had been, like many people at the time who were interested in philosophy and religion, spirituality, had been a reader of Gerald Heard. He had read some of Gerald Heard's books in the 30s. So that's how he first heard about Heard, and then they later met in the 1940s and became good friends and had some interesting adventures later in the 1950s.
I gather that from your book that possibly one of the reasons he had this spiritual awakening in the hospital is that they were using belladonna as a treatment for alcoholics.
Yeah, that's a bit controversial, that whole idea, especially within AA. I think my take on it is, so they had a potion, a kind of a purgative, I think you could maybe call it, that they used, which had all kinds of things in it. But the ingredients were, among the ingredients were belladonna and another herb called henbane, both of which can be actually deadly poisons, and can also, at the right dose, be psychoactive effects, can lead to visions, hallucinations. There's a history of some of this being used in so-called witchcraft, So there's an interesting history with henbane and belladonna. And so it was only part of this cure. So he had this vision, but I think a lot of things were going on with Bill. It wasn't just that simple. I mean, he was hitting bottom as an alcoholic, and he'd stopped drinking. And hardcore alcoholics, when they stop, just the process of stopping drinking, you get the DTs, and you can actually have hallucinations just by stopping drinking, right? So there's that. And he also, there's an interesting little part of his history where he had a grandfather who was a notorious drunk in the 19th century and got sober kind of during the early temperance movement, and told Bill about this vision he had on a mountaintop and how he went to the Congregational Church and basically devoted his life to sobriety. So he also had this story from his grandfather. So I think you have to mix all this together to see what was really at the root cause of this spiritual awakening that Bill had. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just the belladonna, for sure. And a lot of people a lot of people have trouble with people who have a spiritual awakening or revelation with drugs of any kind that's not real, right? Because it's artificially somehow, induced. But I think the bottom line, and this is something Huston Smith used to say, that when it comes to religious experience, it's not about the altered states, it's about the altered traits and what effect does this experience have on your behavior. So in Bill's case, it led him to, inspired him to inspire AA and help countless people get sober over the years. So that's how I judge it. So in my book, it doesn't really matter if or to what extent psychoactive herbs, sacred plant medicines, as people call them now, may have played in his awakening and his revelation. But I think I think it played some effect, had some effect on it.
As I recall, you quote Aldous Huxley, who said that Bill Wilson has started the major movement of consciousness transformation in the 20th century.
Yeah, I think both Heard and Huxley were very impressed with what Wilson had done just as terms of a social movement. I mean, really, what Wilson started was much bigger than just AA or all the other 12-step groups they have now for people who have in recovery from, say, narcotics, sex and love addicts, marijuana, shopping, overeaters, whatever you are. We're all in recovery from something, right? And so Wilson, was influential in all those groups starting, but not just that, the larger so-called small group movement, which came out of that, in a lot of ways came out of AA or was modeled after AA. So this could be women's groups, men's groups, even like Bible study groups, this whole idea of groups, people getting together in small groups for self-exploration. I mean, I think he really set a model. Of course, that was always happening in some way, but I mean, I think he helped popularize what they call now the small group movement,
or the self-help movement,
or self-help. But specifically, as groups of people getting together, in small groups and helping each other. Yeah, self-help, right?
The idea being that you don't have to have a therapist.
Right. That there's a wisdom in the group. And so many people, I think, are looking for community and connection. And that's as big a part of the spiritual search as anything else. It's finding community and connection with other people. So.
Well, since we're talking about pioneers, I think it's worth mentioning that one of the big influences on Bill Wilson was William James.
Yes, that's true. Bill was very eclectic in his spiritual search. I mean, he didn't have much of an upbringing at all. He was abandoned by both parents. He was raised basically by a grandmother, and one of his grandfathers actually was interested in the transcendentalists. He had one grandfather was the drunk, and the other one was another grandfather who was they were from New England, right? He grew up in Vermont. And they were interested and studied and read the Transcendentalists, Thoreau and Emerson. So he had that, but he was interested in William James and also Carl Jung. And the thing that's interesting about William James is after he had this experience that night in Towns Hospital, that spiritual awakening, that vision, the next day or maybe the day before, he was given this book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, read by William James, which had, come out earlier in the 20th century, a couple of decades before. So after he had this experience, that's the book he was reading to try to understand what happened to him. And so I think that book was very influential in the way that AA developed. One of the wonderful things about AA is they are very open-minded in terms of They talk about alcoholics having a spiritual awakening to understand and overcome their addiction, but it's through God as you understand Him, is how they put it. And that was in the 1930s. This was written, and they were a bit ahead of their time in terms of being so open-minded about whatever spiritual path works for you. That's fine. And I think one of the reasons that Bill was open to that, and not everyone in AA was, because it came out of an evangelical Christian movement. So there's a whole other stream in AA early on. But I think it was William James and his open-minded approach to religious experience, spiritual experience, and also James was a serious student of mysticism, psychic phenomenon, parapsychology. I mean, he was really the founder of American psychology. So that open-mindedness, I think, you can really see what comes out of James and also Jung that Bill was interested in.
Well, I think it's fascinating that Bill Wilson, Gerald Heard, and Aldous Huxley were all interested in my field of specialty, parapsychology, psychical research, going way back. In fact, as I recall now, when Aldous Huxley and Gerald Heard came on that trip, a lecture tour to the United States, they went to Durham, North Carolina, because they wanted to meet with J.B. Rhine and see the parapsychology laboratory at Duke University.
Right. That was one of their first stops. But yeah, they were very interested in psychic phenomena, and so was Bill Wilson. I mean, later on, when that's actually another reason that Bill Wilson and they connected through that. But no, that was a very big part of their spiritual interest was all of that. And that in some ways that's better than I do, but maybe that was some of that phenomenon, some of that. It was more acceptable then than it is now. I don't know. What do you think?
There's something to be said that it comes and goes in waves, and the 1930s was such a wave. I think the 1960s was such a wave. I'm under the impression from your book that Bill Wilson may have been engaged in holding seances.
Yes. They called them spook sessions, the ghosts, spooks. And Bill has Bill and his wife Lois, who is considered the founder of another 12-step movement around codependency. They had what they called these spook sessions at their home up in the Hudson Valley outside of New York City. And this was something of an embarrassment for some of the other leaders in AA. Later on, Bill would get into psychedelics, which was even more of an embarrassment or more of a problem with that. But yeah, no, he had interest in that. He had I can't remember the details of it, Jeff, but Bill had a sister who had some encounters with a famous psychic at the time. Like, I can't remember the name, but anyway, he was very interested in that. And some of the early letters that Heard and Wilson exchanged were about, different psychics and research that was going on, UFO sightings later on in the 50s. They were interested in all of that stuff. Yeah.
Well, I guess that, and of course we want to talk about psychedelics, but I think that in the evolution of these figures, one of the important stages they went through prior to getting involved with psychedelics was Vedanta, Hindu Vedanta.
Yes, that's true. Especially Huxley and Heard. I think they interested Wilson in it a bit, but no, Huxley and Heard, they were in Los Angeles, and this would have been in the late 30s and 1940s. And of course, Vedanta, which comes out of the work of Ramakrishna, the Swami back in India, and Vivekananda was one of the early Vedanta leaders who came to the States, I think, in the 1890s to speak at the World Parliament of Religions. And it's really the first time a lot of Americans heard about these exotic things like, Zen or, yoga, or these were new ideas, mysterious yogis from the East. That was new to a lot of people. So in terms of when Huxley and Heard came to Los Angeles, they got very involved with the Vedanta Society and the Vedanta Temple in Hollywood, which was already going. But Huxley and Heard especially Huxley, were so famous that their interest in it, I think, spurred a lot of a larger public interest in Vedanta. For a while, they separated. They had some things they didn't like about the Vedanta Society. I mean, I think, Huxley never liked the idea of gurus at all, and Heard was also a little hesitant to that. So I think partly they saw it as a little cultish and separated themselves from it. Christopher Isherwood, who was another character in this story, another gay man a Brit who came to Los Angeles. He got and was a friend of Heard and Huxley. He got very involved and stayed more involved with the Vedanta Society than they did. But yeah, it was influential in their understanding of mysticism and spirituality and that whole idea of the Brahman, this ultimate reality. So that was a big part of their development. They kind of went through that for a few years.
Because they were really leading-edge thinkers of the time, as soon as the first scientific reports started to emerge about the use of the early psychedelics, mescaline, and the early work with LSD, I'm under the impression that Aldous Huxley was right on top of it and eager to experience it.
Yeah, he was. He was the kind of guy that would, sit around in his home in the Hollywood Hills reading obscure, medical journals, scientific journals about things, as was Heard. And he stumbled across some work that a early psychedelic researcher named Humphrey Osmond was doing way up in Canada. I mean, in Saskatchewan. I mean, way up there in the middle of nowhere. Was basically running a hospital, treating various people, including alcoholics, with mescaline and then later LSD as a therapeutic tool to help them understand their addiction and overcome their addiction. And he was also working with schizophrenics with psychedelics, which didn't work out that well, by the way. But they were writing scientific papers about this, and they weren't the only ones. There were hundreds of papers written about psychedelics and therapy from the late 40s, all the way into the 70s. But Huxley stumbled across this paper by Humphrey Osmond and kind of convinced Osmond to come down to Los Angeles and lead him on a mescaline journey. Because Huxley had been writing about, mysticism, but he wasn't a mystic. I mean, he hadn't had any personal experiences. He wasn't a meditator. He was more of a thinker than a meditator, and he longed to have a mystical experience and saw this would be one way to do it. So he convinced Osmond to come down to Los Angeles and lead him on what became one of the most famous psychedelic journeys of the 50s and 60s, which was at Huxley's house in Los Angeles in 1953. Spring of 1953, I was in utero with my mother when this happened. Something else was being born there, but this idea was being born in Huxley's mind. Anyway, he had this trip, which he wrote about in the book called The Doors of Perception, which came out in 1954, which was the first book that a lot of people in my generation or another earlier generation really read about psychedelics and kind of really started the interest in psychedelics, I think, in the 50s.
Really the first popular book about psychedelics.
Yeah, there were other anthropologists who went down to South America and Mexico, and there had been other work, but it was the first popular book for sure.
And that phrase, the doors of perception, comes out of a statement or a poem, I guess, by William Blake.
Right. So there's a Weil. I can't remember the poem, but can you?
Well, it has something to do with when the doors of perception are cleansed, then we see things as they really are.
Yeah, this bigger reality. And so Huxley had this idea that the brain was, and there's a more nuanced understanding now with, neuropsychology and all that, but that the brain was kind of a reducing valve, and that there was a much bigger reality out there that we could experience. And one of the ways to do that is mescaline or other psychedelic drugs. And I mean, during his first trip on mescaline, what he kept saying was, one of the things he kept saying was, "This is how people ought to see." So yeah, that was a very influential trip, and the book had a big impact.
And so Huxley obviously began sharing the experience with his friend Gerald Heard, who began turning on many of the leading intellectual and cultural figures of that era, the late 40s and early 1950s.
Right. Well, it's true. So while it was Heard who got Huxley interested in philosophy and mysticism initially, it was really Huxley kind of took the lead with psychedelics. But I think Heard went even deeper with it in terms of becoming an enthusiast around it. and then LSD. So Huxley was mescaline, but then later on LSD, which is a much more powerful compound, was used. And yeah, Gerald Heard kind of became kind of the proto Timothy Leary in a way. People from the 60s, of course, remember Timothy Leary as the Pied Piper, the high priest of the psychedelic counterculture. But Gerald Heard was basically doing a similar thing, different in some important ways, but was turning people on to the psychedelic experience. More kind of opinion makers. We call them influencers now, right? Their idea, Huxley and Heard's idea, was that most people couldn't handle or weren't ready for this experience, but certain sort of thought leaders in religion or business or government, that they were kind of hoping that they would plant these seeds of consciousness and they would somehow trickle down in society. I think was partly what they were thinking. Whereas later in the 60s, you had Timothy Leary, who really saw this as an issue of cognitive freedom, and every man should experience this, and a much more democratic and also chaotic and maybe dangerous way of going about it. There was only about 5 years between these two periods. There was, in some ways, it was the same period.
And there was a direct connection that Aldous Huxley met with Timothy Leary.
Yeah. Aldous met with, and so did Gerald Heard, and so did Bill Wilson. They all met or corresponded with Leary. Because Leary was had an appointment at Harvard, and he was doing research with psilocybin. Research is a bit of a misnomer. He was having some pretty wild parties. A little bit of research was going on, but from the very beginning with Leary, it was kind of a social movement was being born rather than real research. They did do a little bit of research, but yeah, they were. Huxley was at MIT for a while, giving a lecture series, invited by Huston Smith. And so that's how they all came together. Huxley happened to be in the Boston area, and that's how they hooked up.
Well, I think it's important now to bring Bill Wilson into the story. He already a recovered alcoholic, but he saw that there might be some potential in the use of psychedelics to help recovering alcoholics who were still seeking a spiritual awakening to achieve that.
I think Bill Wilson's interest in this was threefold. I think he saw, and by reading Humphrey Osmond's research papers, he saw that LSD could help some alcoholics, certainly not all, but some alcoholics have the spiritual awakening that's part of the 12 steps. A lot of people who get into recovery are very resistant to the religious language, the God talk, and the 12 steps. And I think Bill saw this as a way for those kind of more difficult cases, people that, have issues with even the word God, right? So I think that was, of course, in his case, he was already sober, so that wasn't an issue for him. He'd been sober for 20 years. But Bill suffered from depression both before and after he got sober, serious depression. And he was hoping that it would help with his depression, that a psychedelic experience would help with his depression. And he was also still addicted to cigarettes, which was the addiction that killed him in the end. He died of emphysema in 1971. So he was that he had that interest as well. And the last of the third would be, I think they were all hoping that psychedelics would somehow prove that psychic experience was real. It was a way for them to scientifically prove the paranormal exists, right? So I think there were three reasons that they got into this.
And I gather that it became part of you could say a lifestyle for them at that point.
Lifestyle. Well, I guess. Did we even use the word lifestyle?
Well, what I mean is they used it on multiple occasions.
Yeah, it wasn't just a one-shot thing, one-off thing. No, there was a kind of a salon, I would call it, both in New York and in Los Angeles, where they were, in the beginning at least, under doctors' supervision and in a very cautious way. they were taking LSD and exploring it among themselves. And, some very important, people in the business community, or spiritual community, Hollywood people were turning on. And, including, Cary Grant. This was earlier. Well, this was not so much in that salon, but there was a psychiatrist named Oscar Yaniger in Los Angeles who turned on a lot of Hollywood celebrities. But it was Heard who got Yaniger interested in it. So the hand of Heard is there, whether he was actually, in the room with Cary Grant and Jack Nicholson and some of the other people who were turning on in the 60s. It was there was a period where they were very interested in exploring it. They were not, especially with Bill Wilson, he was trying to keep it quiet because it was a very controversial thing within AA. I think the idea, a lot of people have difficulty understanding it. So you're going to use one drug to overcome your addiction to another drug? I mean, it seems a little counterintuitive at first until you understand that the context and the intention behind taking the psychedelic. It's not just to get high in the same way as someone gets high, with alcohol. Intention is everything.
Well, I think one of the important theoretical underpinnings of all of this, especially with regard to addictions, is that the addiction, whatever the addiction is usually viewed as a substitute for a deeper spiritual urge.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's kind of where Jung comes into the picture a little bit, because one of the things that there's a famous correspondence between Carl Jung and Bill Wilson about all this, because one of the early people in AA who was kind of written out of the story because he relapsed was a guy named Roland Hazard, who was a wealthy guy from New England who went all the way to Switzerland to be treated by Jung for his alcoholism. And one of the things that Jung told Roland Hazard was that, alcoholism is this misplaced search. It's a spiritual search. It's interesting. The word spiritus is use the same word for spirituality and for this, what can be a depraving poison. And so Jung thought this was very interesting, and that, and then also William James had a similar idea. We were talking about William James before. He said the only cure for dipsomania, which is a sort of an archaic word for alcoholism, is religiomania. So there was this idea that it wasn't like a cure, like a sort of a pharmaceutical cure, as much as it was a way to see that, yes, this is a misplaced kind of search that someone is going on with drugs and alcohol. This quench for wholeness. In connection. So that was very much a part of the mix.
Now, I think it's worth mentioning that throughout the whole book, you tell your own personal story, which involves both the use of psychedelics and the use of alcohol. I don't know which came first in your case, but they got mixed together and it became a serious problem for you. Yeah,
one of the other reasons I wrote, that I was interested, especially in Bill Wilson, was because of my own struggles with alcohol. And in my case, it was cocaine and alcohol, the combination of the two. So it's funny because the way the book came out, it's a group biography of these three people, but I'm very much in the book. It's also a recovery memoir, which was not my original idea at all. I actually kind of fought the idea. That was the publisher's idea. So I had proposed this book as a straight group biography, but I think in the preface, I mentioned, just briefly mentioned my own story. And then this book was published by University of California Press, which is an academic publisher. And one of the things that they do is they send both the proposal and the final manuscript out to scholars in the field to review, right? And they sent my proposal out, and Professor Jeffrey Kripal from Rice, who you probably know, right? He was one of the people they sent it to, and he suggested to my editor at UC Press that, Don Lattin should be the fourth character in this book, because that's why, why are you so interested in these three guys? They're my grandfather's generation. Obviously, I didn't know them, right? And I thought that was ridiculous, actually, when I first heard it. And I thought it was kind of kind of be pompous of me to tell my story along with theirs. And, part of it was I was a newspaper reporter for most of my career, my early part of my career. And I was a dirty word. You don't really talk about yourself. The story's not about you, right? So it was kind of a new thing for me to put myself, especially at that level of detail, into a book. But I was encouraged to do it, and I tried it. And so I started weaving my own story in with the story of these three guys. And whether it worked or not is, I guess we can debate, but that's what I did. So yeah, you wind up knowing more than you probably need to know about me when you read this book.
Well, one of the fascinating insights that I got out of your experience and the experience of these other important figures, not that you're not important, is that I guess it's the idea best expressed in Huxley's second book about psychedelics, Heaven and Hell, in which he talked about that when you open up to these supersensible realms, you can experience ecstasy, but it could just go in the other direction.
Yeah. The agony and the ecstasy. And yeah. And I write about, one of the things I write about in Distilled Spirits, and also the first time I wrote about it was just an afterword in my earlier book, which was Harvard Psychedelic Club, about my own experience as a very naive 19-year-old, freshman at Berkeley with LSD, having kind of the ecstasy followed by the agony, and having a very difficult time, basically a psychotic kind of breakdown, partly from, I think, a really bad acid trip. But also other things that I look at it differently now, looking back on it. But at the time, it just seemed like a bad trip that didn't go away for a few months. So that was one of the agonies and ecstasies of my life. I mean, it was a very powerful and difficult experience, both the wonderful trip and the bad trip. And I write about that in both books. But I definitely see that these compounds are a double-edged sword. Heaven and hell. And that's why I really always try to be a little cautious, that people need to be very careful when they're taking psychedelic drugs. And I think right now we're entering this kind of, some people think we're entering this post-prohibition period, kind of like we did with marijuana. Several cities and maybe states are about to decriminalize psychedelics, which politically I'm all in favor of, and I think that they should do that. But I think people have to be very cautious, especially young people who haven't really discovered who they are yet. And that was kind of the problem with my experience. I didn't really understand who I was, and then I was sort of blowing that incomplete I give myself away, and I was really left with nothing. I think we really need guides, experienced guides and teachers for this exploration, and that's one of the inspiring things that's happening now. There's an underground movement of psychedelic guides, and now it's becoming above ground. There are colleges that are openly teaching. You can get a credential to be a psychedelic therapist now, at least in San Francisco and a few other places. So this stuff is coming up, and it's an exciting time, but it's also there's a little, I would say, irrational exuberance around this now, like there was back in the 60s. That we're going to save the world with psychedelics, and it didn't really turn out that way then, and it probably won't now. So, and that's actually what I write about in my most recent book, is Changing Our Minds, Psychedelic Sacraments and the New Psychotherapy. That's the book where I'm writing about sort of the history, but also what's happening now and what we can expect in the future with the so-called psychedelic renaissance.
Well, I'm happy to let our viewers know that you and I are contemplating doing some additional interviews, because there's much more to cover. So much more. I mean, we're just scratching the surface right now. But I think another important aspect of this has to do with death and dying. All of these figures you've written about are now gone. And there was a moving passage in your book about Huxley's death. He died on the very same day as John F. Kennedy. I remember well reading in the paper about Huxley's death the day I learned of Kennedy's death. And I gather that he requested, I think it was LSD right at the time of his death.
Yes, he did. And as people were watching television in the hospital about the JFK assassination, this was going on. He was on his deathbed, dying of cancer. and he wrote a handwritten note, which survives. I actually saw it at the Huxley archive at UCLA. He wrote in shaky handwriting 100 mg micrograms intermuscular, and trying to get Laura, his second wife, Laura Huxley, to give him a shot of LSD to go off, and that's what he did. And Laura writes a beautiful long letter describing this experience, and it's actually similar to a scene that Huxley wrote in his last novel, Island, where there was more of a utopian idea where this would be offered to people as kind of a way to embrace the next world, whatever that world might be. So yeah, he certainly did.
I'm actually very interested in that aspect of psychedelic use. It became obvious, I think, to Leary and Alpert and Ralph Metzner when they wrote The Psychedelic Experience and based it on the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Exactly, which they did at Huxley's suggestion, by the way. It was Huxley who suggested that they read the Tibetan Book of the Dead before they wrote The Psychedelic Experience. And it was at Taruko College, Gerald Heard's retreat center, that the author or the discoverer of the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is really a theosophy, modern theosophy text, it's my understanding of it. It's not an ancient text, but anyway, that it was at Taruko College through Heard that Huxley got it. So you can actually see that whole progression there, not to mention the Beatles discovering all this through the Psychedelic Experience book. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interest around death and dying in psychedelics. Some of the research that's going on right now is helping people who have a terminal cancer diagnosis, not to treat the cancer, but to treat the depression and the existential anxiety that can go along with a terminal diagnosis. So using, it's actually psilocybin rather than LSD, but psilocybin with therapy to work through that. And you know, a lot of people who, I don't know if you've tripped or want to talk about it, but I have, and I do talk about it. And it's in some ways, it sort of can seem at times as like a dress rehearsal for death. And the experiences you can have mirror what is so-called near-death experiences that people report. And I don't pretend to understand that, but it seems to have something to do with ego dissolution. And kind of in psychological terms, maybe a derealization or depersonalization, where your normal egoic, I, me mind, monkey mind finally quiets down and you connect with some bigger sense of self. And maybe that's what happens when you die. Who knows? But I have experienced that with psychedelics, which is also a way to actually work with depression, too. That same dynamic, at least for me, it's been helpful. And I write about that in the last book, too. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting work, I think, to be done with death and dying in psychedelics. I think that's going to be real important in the next, 10 years.
Well, just for the record, let me say I've used a lot of psychedelics in my life, probably 100 times or so, practically all when I was much younger. But I have to say that, what it did for me is it spurred me on to a lifelong study of parapsychology, consciousness, and all of the related areas that I cover on the New Thinking Aloud channel. So for myself, I regard it as a very positive experience almost consistently. I think of the more than 100 psychedelic trips I've had, maybe I had one that was bad. And I'm under the impression that a lot of it has to do with, one's family upbringing and childhood. You're going to confront whatever hidden pain you have. And I was fortunate. I came out of a good, loving family, so I didn't have a lot of that to work through.
Yes. I think that's very true. That's very true. And it's interesting because, the reason I said you may or may not want to talk about it is that a lot of people have been hesitant to talk about it, partly because it was often illegal what they were doing. And and maybe not socially acceptable in some circles, but that's changing, and so a lot of people are, and I think a lot of people of our generation, I mean, maybe you're a little older than I am, I'm not sure, but a lot of people of our generation, had very positive experiences, and maybe they never tripped again, and now maybe they're retiring and they're retired and they're open to try it again. They don't have the same responsibilities. The kids are gone. You don't have to worry about who's watching the kids when you're tripping, or so all those issues aren't there. And also these people are running, like, the government and pharmaceutical companies and universities. And so there's, I think, this whole openness we have seems like all of a sudden to psychedelics, because there was such a crackdown on not just use, but research, for 20, 30 years after the 60s. That's finally ending. So it's a very exciting time.
One of the points you make in your book, which I think is worth mentioning in passing, is that psychedelics may have had a real influence on the growth of the Silicon Valley technology area in the San Francisco Bay Area.
People like Steve Jobs said that it was an important tool for him. The guy who invented the mouse, the computer mouse, Doug, I think it's Engelbart, he definitely said that it was during there were some experiments that were being done in Silicon Valley. They didn't call it Silicon Valley then; it was the peninsula south of San Francisco, on creativity, LSD and creativity. That were being done at the time in the mid 60s. And Engelbart was part of that. And he credits some insights he had to figuring out the computer mouse, which was very important in that whole second wave of personal computers. So yeah, I think it played a role. It played a role for sure.
You also mentioned in your book that Henry Luce, the publisher of Time magazine, and his famous wife, Claire Booth Luce, were turned on, I think, by Gerald Heard.
Heard, yeah. And that's interesting because someone who was in the news media for many years, there was some very positive reporting by the sort of Time Life empire. You have to remember, Time Life back then was like, Facebook and, Zuckerberg are now, right? It was very influential. And there were some very positive stories about early psychedelic work in Time and Life. And one of the reasons that may have been is that Henry Luce and his wife had been turned on by Gerald Heard and thought this was a very promising tool. A lot of people did then. You have to remember, this was in the 1950s, so the whole craziness of the 60s hadn't happened yet. LSD was still legal. Most people hadn't heard of it, and those who had heard of it saw it as, this potentially useful tool that we could use to for greater insight, understand mental illness, that sort of thing.
Well, Don Lattin, this has been a fascinating conversation about a very important part of our contemporary history, and it's still an ongoing story. So I'm very excited to be with you today. I'm looking forward to our future conversations. Don, thank you so much for being with me.
As am I, Jeff. Thanks very much. Yeah, you're right. We did just scratch the surface, didn't we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.